Welcome back to another episode of High School Not So Much a Musical. This is part two of our two-part series with Kevin McShan, who is a journalist diagnosed with cerebral palsy at birth. In this episode, we will cover what the world needs to do to become a more inclusive place for people with disabilities. We'll get into that right after this.
This is High School Not So Much a Musical, a podcast that takes you on a ride through the peaks and valleys of a high school journey. Here are your presenters, Nitin Jaladanki and Ayush Agarwal.
Yeah, so you mentioned that one of the benefits of having a podcast was that you get to meet all these great and interesting people, and some of them, they might become your role models. And it's the same for us because, Nitin, Ayush, and I, we're all high schoolers, and the whole the whole thing about our podcast is that we bring on people who have some sort of expertise in some sort of niche or some very small and unique thing, so that we can learn from them as we have a conversation with them. And not only are we learning about what they do and maybe what's out there after we graduate from college, but also our listeners are doing the same thing. So our listeners know what our podcast High School Not So Much a Musical is about. But you briefly touched up upon what Let's Have This Conversation is about. It's about news, but could you talk more in depth about what your podcast is and maybe some of your favorite parts of it?
Yeah, so I've had the great privilege of hosting the podcast for about a year and a half. I started in May of 2020. And the podcast is all about having authentic conversations about news and business and entrepreneurship, and the way certain news topics have affect our everyday life. I also talk to entrepreneurs and CEOs, and I have a section on there all about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in a nutshell, the podcast is about having authentic conversations about thoughtful and thought-provoking topics, because I think when you're willing to have uncomfortable conversations that can make a difference, I think that's where significant progress can be felt and made. So the podcast is all about having authentic conversations about issues in the news, topics that I find particularly interesting, and how it relates to societal life. So it's a mixture of a lot of things, but the overriding theme of it is to have authentic, thought-provoking, and meaningful conversations with a variety of different people.
Yeah, ours is similar in that way, where we really like to have organic conversations with people where we're asking them questions, they're asking us questions as well. But on your podcast, is it mainly just you talking to your listeners, or are you bringing on people and having a conversation with them as well?
Yeah, so the premise behind the podcast is an interview style podcast. So I bring on guests to have conversations about the news, politics, entrepreneurship, careers, diversity, equity, and inclusion, sports, politics, and business. So it's a hodgepodge of all different types of topics, but generally, it's an interview style podcast. I try to provide an objective and fair view of the topics that I cover, and through the people that I interview.
Definitely, yeah. And like you said, the discourse is especially important because for example, at our school, we have something called Neurodiversity Week. I think they introduced it last year, where it's all just about educating people about this issue, so that way they naturally become more inclined to include those who might be, neurodiverse or a little bit different. So we actually kind of want to shift gears a bit. We've talked a lot about your history of discrimination because of your precondition, etc. But do you have any questions for us, regarding our high school careers or regarding, like I mentioned, the neurodiversity week we have in school?
Yeah, so I'm always curious to ask people about their perception of what diversity, equity, and inclusion means to them, in the sense of giving every person an equal opportunity to be heard. So I'm curious, specifically because you guys are in a certain developmental stage of your educational journey. What does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you guys?
I think that this is like a really great topic because something that Ayush and I were a part of last year was something called the Political Environmental Activism Club. And a huge part of that was kind of reaching out to like local government people about opening up new possibilities for people who are in underprivileged areas, and especially like because there's so many like racial minorities within California itself. I think like a huge part of being diverse is that we need to make sure that everybody has equal opportunity to have like the kind of the same education that we're having, even if it's not at the same level. It's just having the same opportunities. So like we have the opportunity to go to a lot of different places, something called term projects at the end of the year. So I think that mostly everything about diversity and inclusion is just about having the open-mindedness to allow people to have the same ideas as you and to not view anybody as different. It's more about viewing everybody as one, and that if all of us succeed as one, there's a greater output compared to just one of us succeeding. Ayush, you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I think another thing I want to add on is the very basis of diversity, equity, and inclusion is like kind of making sure that people don't feel excluded based on factors that they cannot control. Like if you're born just different, then you can't control that, and therefore you shouldn't be penalized for it in society, because you're doing everything in your power to kind of combat that and like use that as an advantage. But if you can't control it, then you can't control it. It's out of your control. But what I do think is that if somebody has something within their control, but they aren't taking advantage of that particular opportunity, then that's when I think diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of doesn't apply as much. For example, if somebody is, morbidly obese, like 400, 500 pounds, and they're not doing anything about it, then that's when, it becomes an issue, because sure, people do have genetic predispositions to being obese, but if you're that obese, that just means that you're not putting in the work to kind of like rein in your diet or put in the discipline and lose the weight. So that's when I think diversity, equity, and inclusion becomes a little bit sketchy. But I think at the fundamental level, the idea that you shouldn't change your perception of someone based on factors that they cannot control, I think that is a very, very important message.
Yeah, so for me, I'm actually I really like talking to people who have disabilities, and that's one of the reasons I reached out to you. And I'm very passionate about building assistive technologies to help out people with disabilities, so they're not exposed to no, there's no diversity. They're not exposed to they're not treated different than people who are considered normal in society's eyes. So recently, or this summer, my grandma, she works at a orphanage in rural India, and some of the students there, or some of the people there, the children, they were diagnosed with ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, and they all go to school there, and they were forced to repeat the grade, or they were going to be forced to repeat the grade because their English was really poor and they couldn't really understand how to communicate and express themselves correctly. So what I did was I didn't want them to have to repeat the grade or anything, because it would really take a toll on them, and they would be set back and they would be thought as different than everyone else. So I created this program, and I wrote some software that would help them. It would basically act as an aid to help them understand and comprehend different emotions, where they could talk into a microphone, and it would tell them the emotion that was conveyed, and the sentence they just said, so they can be like, okay, I just said something in a fearful voice, and then they'll relate, okay, what I just said, that's fearful. So it's helping them learn the English language, because in India, like, most people think that their students in schools, they're going to be talking in like Hindi or Telugu, languages like that, but they are actually mostly talking English. So they would have been held back if they weren't able to learn English.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you all for sharing that, and certainly that was one of the reasons that I wanted to start my own podcast, is because I think the first step to progress is having a conversation about the issues and the disparities, and how we can work together to sort of unify the disparities in terms of closing them, so that we can all level the playing field, for sure.
Definitely, yeah. In terms of any other questions that we had for you, we kind of wanted to talk about, what you're doing to raise awareness about this issue. So obviously, you have your podcast, and you're using that to spread the word about the importance of neurodiversity and kind of accepting people based on preconditions that they cannot control. You also mentioned that, you have a history in journalism. So are there any specific newspapers that you currently write for? And if you do write for them, what do you talk about? Is it anything related to this issue of people with disabilities?
I recently, I don't know if you guys know this, but December 3rd is actually the International Day for Persons with Disabilities. And I recently wrote a blog for a company. They're called Accessible Media Inc., and they get paid by the government of Ontario to produce programming that the government of Canada to produce a programming that is specific to addressing the issues of disability and inclusion for individuals with disabilities. And, I wrote a blog for them about the importance of the International Day for Persons with Disabilities. So I've began a partnership with AMI. I've also worked extensively with the John McGivney Children's Center, which is the local children's treatment center for folks with for children with disabilities and their families, to really work with the center to help them allocate their resources and give them sort of a lived experience perspective on how they can best serve children with disabilities. I've also worked with the center to help them develop what's called a transition to adulthood program, because the children that access the services of the center age out of the system at 18 to 21, and oftentimes their parents or themselves are left to sort of navigate the system on their own. So the center has done a great job of sort of providing an outlet or at least the start of transitional planning. I also sit on a board of directors for an organization called Beyond Disability Network, and here in Windsor, and the objective of the network is to sort of help streamline medical and other services for people with disabilities so that they can live a full and complete life. So there are certainly great benefits of volunteering, and certainly I try to do that through my volunteer efforts as well. I think you're muted.
Okay, yeah. So I think that's all we have for this podcast. we're going to be splitting it up into two parts. And one of the staples of our podcast one of the staples of High School Not So Much a Musical is that we ask the person that we've brought on just like a general tips question, where they can talk about, what they can give any advice to the high schoolers listening. So, Mr. Kevin McShan, if you could give any advice to the high schoolers listening, what would it be?
Well, I think when we look at advice for high schoolers is don't limit your expectations of yourself. I always say that the only standard of expectation that you have to reach is your own, because once you determine whatever that is for you individually, then you can rise to a standard of expectation and fulfillment that is meaningful for you. So my advice to any high schoolers listening to this is simple. Don't limit yourself or expectations based on what other people have perceived for you. Always set your own standard in life and believe that an inclusive environment is your destiny to discover on your own, and certainly the reaps of the benefits that you get by setting your own standard of expectation will help force multiply any positivity or any prosperity in your life. So my advice would be don't limit your expectations and always reach for the possible.
Thank you for those inspiring words, Mr. McShan. So to our listeners, that was the end of our second part of the two-part series with Mr. McShan, who is a journalist and podcaster with Cerebral Palsy. It was really inspiring to hear what Mr. McShan had to say about his conditions, the difficulties, and the barriers that he's dealt with in life, how he overcame them, and where he is at today. So thank you for taking the time to come on with us, Mr. McShan.
My most sincere pleasure, and I want to thank the three of you for having me today. It's most appreciated.
That's our show for today. Now roll the credits. High School Not So Much a Musical is hosted by Ayush Agarwal, Nitin Jaladanki, and Rishi Sinha. Narration by Samhit Padala. Music from Louis Luang Relaxation Cafe, Tune Pocket, and Infraction. If you like the show, please recommend it to your friends and family. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.